There's a photo that still circulates in certain Liverpool pubs. A man's torso covered in perfect iron-shaped burn marks. Dealers who've seen it all say the same thing. That's what happens when you short George Bromley. In the 90s, Bromley didn't sell drugs or run doors. He taxed the people who did. Kidnap a dealer, take the stash, apply fear. His 15-quid iron from Argos did the rest. Most victims talked before the metal touched skin. The ones who didn't ended up like the photo. By 1997, he was rich, hated, and officially warned by police that someone wanted him dead. A $100,000 contract was openly circulating. Bromley laughed it off. On November 18th, he walked into a friend's kitchen, took off his body armor, sat with a cup of tea, and 30 seconds later, a silenced pistol ended him. 3 shots, no sound, no suspects, no convictions. The killer got the money and vanished. Some murders aren't meant to be solved, and to understand why this one mattered, you have to understand the chaos that made a man like Bromley possible in the first place. The next part shows exactly how the untouchable died, and why 28 years later, no one has paid the price. Ring the bell so you never miss an upload like this. To understand George Bromley, you first need to understand the city that created him. Liverpool in the 1990s was a battleground. The rave economy had flooded the city with ecstasy cash. Clubs like Cream, 051, and the Grafton were pulling thousands through the doors every weekend, and every pill sold inside meant someone was getting rich. At the same time, heroin was destroying entire estates. Netherley, Norris Green, Croxteth. Communities that had survived the dock closures and Thatcher's cuts were being hollowed out by smack. And into that chaos walked a new generation who didn't respect the old rules. For decades, Liverpool's Underworld had operated under a code. You didn't involve women. You didn't involve children. You settled disputes privately, preferably with fists, and if weapons came out, you kept it between the people involved. The old godfathers, men who'd come up through armed robbery and safe blowing in the 60s and 70s, enforced that code ruthlessly. But by the mid-90s, those godfathers were dead, in prison or retired to Spain. And the young lads stepping up didn't care about codes. Clubland became the new front line. Security firms weren't just checking IDs at the door. They were controlling drug distribution inside the venues. Firms like The Team and Link Security turned nightclub doors into 6-figure earners. If you wanted to sell pills in Cream, you paid tax. If you refused, you got hurt. If you fought back, people died. The violence escalated fast. Shootings that would have been front-page scandals in the 80s barely made the local news by 1996. Firearms that had once been rare, something you borrowed for a specific job, became everyday carry. Glocks, revolvers, sawn-off shotguns, they were everywhere. And the people using them were younger, more reckless, and more willing to break every rule their predecessors had lived by. Women got beaten, children got threatened, innocent bystanders got shot in drive-bys aimed at rival dealers. This was the world George Bromley fed off. He wasn't a drug dealer, he was a predator who hunted drug dealers. The business model was simple: find someone making money, kidnap them, take everything they had, and make sure they were too terrified to ever come back for revenge. It was called taxing, and in a city where the police were overwhelmed and the courts were backlogged, it was a growth industry. Bromley wasn't the only one doing it, but he was the best at it. Because while other crews used baseball bats or knives, Bromley had something that left a mark no one ever forgot. Something cheap, portable, and utterly terrifying, and his reputation was built on one 15-pound appliance that turned grown men into sobbing wrecks before it ever touched their skin. The steam iron. That's what separated George Bromley from every other taxman working Liverpool in the 90s. Other crews used violence, sure, baseball bats to the knees, knives to the face, petrol poured over someone's car while they watched, but those methods were quick, painful, brutal, but over fast. Bromley's method was different. He made you wait. The routine was always the same. His crew would snatch a dealer off the street, usually outside a pub or after they'd left a flat with a bag full of cash. They'd bundle them into a car, drive to a safe house, and strip them naked. Then came the chair, hands cable-tied behind the back, ankles bound to the legs, and then Bromley would walk in carrying a steam iron. He'd plug it in, set it to maximum heat, and wait. While the plate heated up, he'd ask questions. Calm, almost polite. Where's the rest of the gear? Where's the cash stashed? Who else is involved? Most people started talking immediately, but Bromley didn't trust first answers, so he'd keep heating the iron. And just when the plate started glowing orange, he'd drip water onto it. That hiss, that sharp, angry sound of steam erupting, that's what broke people. Because they knew what came next. If the answers still weren't good enough, he'd press the iron against skin. Chest first, then stomach, then thighs. The smell was the worst part, apparently. Burning flesh mixed with sweat and fear. Some victims passed out, others vomited. A few lost control of their bowels entirely. But everyone talked. Bromley could extract every pound, every wrap, every name in the supply chain. And when he was done, he'd leave them tied up and make a call to their associates. You've got 2 hours to drop 50 grand at this location, or we come back tomorrow and do it again. They always paid. Because the alternative wasn't just more pain, it was living with the scars. Circular burn marks across your torso that every dealer in Liverpool would recognize instantly. A permanent mark that said, I broke. I gave him everything. I begged. In a world where reputation was the only currency that mattered, those scars were a death sentence. George Bromley was born in 1964 and raised on the Kirkby and Croxteth estates, the same estates that would later produce some of Merseyside's most violent crews. He came of age in the late 80s, right as the old Liverpool was dying and the new one was being born in blood and ecstasy money. He wasn't a godfather. He wasn't building an empire. He was a freelance enforcer who realized that fear was more profitable than loyalty. By the mid-90s, he'd built a small fortune on screams, but every scar he left was also a reason someone wanted him dead. Every dealer he tortured had friends. Every crew he taxed had pride. And in a city where violence had become normalized and the old codes no longer applied, grudges didn't fade. They compounded. And by 1997, George Bromley's list of enemies was longer than his list of friends. But one incident, one act of violence that broke even Liverpool's collapsed moral code, put him at the very top of someone's contract list. George Bromley didn't just make enemies through taxing, he made them through sheer, uncontrolled brutality. And the incidents that stacked up between 1990 and 1997 read like a masterclass in how to guarantee someone eventually puts a contract on your head. November 1990. The Brewers Arms pub in Anfield. Bromley and his associate Richard Halpin are drinking when Jimmy Callahan walks in. There's history between them. Exactly what kind, the court records don't say. But it's bad enough that Callahan pulls out a handgun and opens fire. Both Bromley and Halpin are hit. Both survive. And here's where it gets interesting. They both cooperate with police. In Liverpool's Underworld, that's unthinkable. Snitching to the law, even when you're the victim, marks you as weak. But Bromley and Halpin give statements. They name Callahan. They agree to testify. Jimmy Callahan gets arrested and charged with attempted murder. Then, weeks before trial, both witnesses suddenly develop amnesia. Can't remember who shot them. Can't remember what happened. Might have been an accident. Could have been anyone, really. The case collapses. Callahan walks free, and George Bromley waits. Several months later, Jimmy Callahan leaves the Malibu Club on London Road in the early hours of the morning. He's heading to his car when Bromley steps out of the shadows with a knife. What happens next is described in witness statements as frenzied and sustained. Bromley stabs Callahan repeatedly: chest, stomach, back, legs. By the time bystanders pull him off, Callahan is barely conscious and bleeding out on the pavement. He survives, but the damage is catastrophic. He's left wheelchair-bound for life with a colostomy bag and permanent nerve damage. Bromley is never charged. No witnesses willing to testify. No evidence that holds up in court. But the message is sent. Cross George Bromley and you don't just get hurt, you get destroyed. Fast forward to 1994. Thomas Cross, a doorman working in Widnes, is shot outside Chase's nightclub. The accused? George Bromley. The charge? Attempted murder. The case goes to trial in 1995. Bromley's defense? Self-defense. The jury buys it, or at least can't prove otherwise. He walks free again. By now, Bromley's untouchable. He survived being shot, beaten multiple attempted murder charges, and built a reputation that makes even hardened criminals nervous. But he's also getting reckless. And then comes the incident that breaks the code entirely: the Royal Court Theatre attack. Bromley and several associates kick in the door of a rival doorman's home. They stab him repeatedly in front of his pregnant girlfriend. When she tries to intervene, tries to protect him, Bromley beats her unconscious. A pregnant woman. Even in a city where the old rules had already collapsed, this was too far. Women had always been off-limits. Pregnant women? Untouchable. But Bromley didn't care. The code was dead, and he'd just proved it. Joey Owens, a doorman who later wrote about Liverpool's Underworld in his memoir, Pain and Plenty of It, described the attack as the moment people realized Bromley had no limits, no boundaries, no line he wouldn't cross. And in a world where reputation was everything, that made him both the most feared man in Liverpool and the most obvious target. Because if George Bromley could do that to a pregnant woman, what would he do to you? Suddenly, paying $100 grand to make him disappear didn't seem excessive. It seemed like self-preservation. By 1997, Bromley had survived one assassination attempt, multiple court cases, and countless enemies who wanted him dead. He knew another attempt was coming. He knew it was serious. Because this time, the warning came officially, in writing, from Merseyside police themselves. An Osman warning is not something police hand out lightly. It's a formal, written notice that says, "We have credible intelligence that someone is planning to kill you. The threat is real. The threat is imminent. And we're telling you now because we might not be able to stop it." George Bromley received his Osman warning in 1997. The intelligence was specific. There was a contract, £100,000, and it was circulating openly across Liverpool's underworld, pub to pub, estate to estate. Everyone knew about it. Dealers talked about it. Doormen whispered about it. Even people outside the game had heard the rumours. Someone wanted George Bromley dead badly enough to put up serious money. When detectives sat Bromley down and explained the situation, his response was pure arrogance. He laughed. He told them he'd been dealing with threats his entire life. He'd survived one shooting already. He knew how to handle himself. And besides, Who in Liverpool had the balls to actually come for him? But privately, Bromley wasn't laughing. He started wearing a Kevlar body vest every single day. Under his shirt, under his jacket, everywhere he went, the vest went with him. He carried a loaded handgun on his person at all times, a knife strapped to his ankle, a spare magazine in his car just in case. He stopped following routines, different routes to different places, never the same pub 2 nights running, never stayed anywhere long enough to become predictable, and he made plans to leave. Bromley had a wife and 2 young sons living in the family home in Croxteth. The plan was to sell up and move the whole family to Portugal. Permanent. Get out of Liverpool, get out of the game, live off the money he'd already made and disappear into the sunshine before the contract could be fulfilled. He'd even started looking at properties on the Algarve. But here's the thing about contracts in the underworld. They don't expire. They don't get called off because the target moves abroad. If anything, running makes you look weak, and weakness invites consequences. So Bromley kept his plans quiet and kept his vest on. Except for one night. November 18th, 1997. It was a Tuesday. Cold. Dark by 5 o'clock. Nothing special about the day, just another evening in Liverpool as winter set in. Bromley had been invited to the home of Charlie Sager, a 57-year-old former armed robber turned legitimate restaurateur. Sager lived at 6 Viner Court Road in West Derby, a big detached house with an open-plan kitchen and a heated swimming pool out back. The kind of place that said, "I've made it. I'm out of the game. I'm respectable now." Bromley had been to the house multiple times. He trusted Sager. They had history. And Bromley had even talked about buying the property himself when Sager eventually retired to Spain. So when Bromley arrived just after 5 p.m, he did something he hadn't done in months. He took off his body armor. He sat down at the kitchen island, made himself a cup of tea, and opened the Liverpool Daily Post. The paper was running a follow-up story on Stephen Cole's murder, a machete killing at the Farmers Arms pub the year before that had shocked even Liverpool's hardened underworld. Bromley shook his head as he read. He muttered something to Sager about how the people involved were lucky to walk away from that one. Then the doorbell rang, and in less than 30 seconds, the man who'd spent months preparing for an assassination walked into the one place he thought he was safe, and died without his armor, without his gun, and without a chance to fight back. George Bromley sat at Charlie Sager's kitchen island, reading the Liverpool Daily Post. The house was warm, quiet, safe. Outside, the November evening had already turned dark. Inside, Bromley was mid-conversation with Sager about the Stephen Cole murder case, the machete killing at the Farmers Arms that had dominated local news the year before. Then the doorbell rang. Sager walked to the front door and opened it. Standing on the doorstep was a figure in dark clothing, face partially obscured, hands stuffed in pockets. Before Sager could say a word, the figure pushed past him into the hallway, and that's when George Bromley realized what was happening. He stood up from the kitchen island. No time to run, no time to reach for a weapon he wasn't carrying, no body armor to absorb what came next. The figure stepped into the kitchen doorway and raised a handgun fitted with a silencer. 3 shots, all 3 hit Bromley in the head at point-blank range. The first dropped him instantly. The second and third were insurance, execution-style follow-ups to make absolutely certain the job was done. George Bromley collapsed onto the kitchen floor without uttering a sound. The shooter turned, walked calmly back through the hallway, and disappeared into the November darkness. The entire sequence, doorbell to exit, took less than 30 seconds. Charlie Sager stood frozen in his own hallway, watching the most feared enforcer in Liverpool bleed out on his kitchen tiles. Then he made the call to emergency services. When paramedics arrived at 6 Viner Court Road minutes later, they found George Bromley face down in a spreading pool of blood. All 3 shots had struck the head. There was no saving him. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Police arrived shortly after and cordoned off the entire property. The house was pristine. No signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle. Just a body, 3 shell casings, and a killer who'd vanished without leaving a trace. Charlie Sager gave his statement immediately. He told detectives exactly what happened. Doorbell rang, stranger at the door, pushed past him, shot Bromley, left. But here's where the story gets complicated, because Charlie Sager wasn't just a former armed robber turned restaurateur. He was one of Liverpool's most notorious underworld figures, a man with his own long history of violence, his own enemies, and his own reasons to want certain people dead. And when detectives started digging into the relationship between Sager and Bromley, they found something interesting. George Bromley had been planning to buy Sager's house. They discussed it multiple times. Bromley wanted the property. Sager was planning to sell and retire to Spain. It was supposed to be a straightforward deal between old friends, but there was one problem. Bromley had told people he was planning to pay well under market value, and Sager, according to multiple sources, wasn't happy about it. So now detectives had a victim who died in a friend's kitchen, and a homeowner with a potential financial motive. But Sager had an alibi. He was standing right there when it happened. He didn't pull the trigger. He was a witness, not a suspect. Unless, of course, he was something else entirely. Unless Charlie Sager had opened that door, knowing exactly who was on the other side, and exactly what they were there to do. Ambia. And within hours of George Bromley's murder, Merseyside police had a prime suspect, Charlie Sager. On the surface, it made sense. Bromley died in Sager's house. Sager opened the door. Sager was the only witness, and now detectives were hearing whispers about a property deal gone sour, about Bromley trying to lowball Sager on the house price, about tensions that had been building for weeks. But there was a problem with the Charlie Sager theory. He didn't pull the trigger. Someone else walked through that door, shot Bromley 3 times in the head, and disappeared into the night. So even if Sager was involved, he wasn't the shooter, which meant police needed to find the person who actually did it. And that's when the investigation hit its first major obstacle. No one was talking. In a city where informants and underworld sources usually provided at least some leads, the Bromley murder produced absolute silence. Dealers who normally couldn't keep their mouths shut suddenly developed amnesia. Doormen who'd spent years bad-mouthing Bromley refused to even acknowledge they'd known him. The £100,000 contract had been common knowledge weeks before the murder. But now, no one had heard of it. No one knew who put it up. No one had any idea who might have collected it. It was a wall of silence so complete it felt orchestrated. Still, detectives pressed forward. They searched Sager's house top to bottom. They interviewed neighbors, associates, anyone who might have seen something. They pulled phone records, financial records, anything that might connect Sager to a hired killer, and they found nothing. No forensic evidence linking Sager to the crime. No phone calls to suspicious numbers in the days before the murder. No unexplained cash withdrawals. Nothing. But the detectives weren't convinced of his innocence. So, on December 10, 1997, less than 3 weeks after Bromley's murder, police arrested Charlie Sager and charged him with murder. The theory was simple. Sager had lured Bromley to his house, arranged for a hitman to be waiting, and orchestrated the execution. He might not have pulled the trigger, but he'd set the trap. Sager denied everything. He told police the same story he'd told from the beginning. Doorbell rang, stranger pushed past him, shot Bromley, left. He had no idea who the shooter was. He had no involvement in any contract. He was as shocked as anyone. but the Crown Prosecution Service thought they had enough to proceed. The case went to trial in 1998 at Liverpool Crown Court. And this is where things get truly bizarre. Because the prosecution's case relied heavily on motive, the property deal, the financial dispute, the tension between the two men. But when it came time to prove that Sager had actually arranged the hit, the evidence was thin, circumstantial, built on inference and suspicion rather than hard facts. The defense tore it apart. They argued that Sager had no control over who rang his doorbell, that being present when a murder happens doesn't make you guilty of murder, that the prosecution was confusing bad luck with criminal conspiracy, and the jury agreed. On June 5, 1998, after just a few hours of deliberation, they returned a verdict of not guilty. Charlie Sager walked out of Liverpool Crown Court a free man. George Bromley's murder remained unsolved, and the person who actually pulled the trigger, they were never identified, never charged, and almost certainly collected their £100,000 without ever facing consequences. But here's the thing. Just because Sager was acquitted doesn't mean he was innocent. And just because the killer was never caught doesn't mean people don't know who did it. Because in Liverpool's underworld, everyone knows. They've always known. They just decided a long time ago that some murders don't need solving. So who killed George Bromley? 28 years later, the official answer is still, we don't know. But the unofficial answer, the one whispered in Liverpool pubs and hinted at in true crime forums, is a lot more complicated. Because there are three main theories about what really happened that night at 6 Viner Court Road. And depending on who you ask, each one sounds plausible. Theory 1, Charlie Sager orchestrated it. This is the theory Merseyside police ran with when they charged Sager with murder. The argument goes like this. Sager and Bromley had a falling out over the house sale. Bromley was trying to lowball him, demanding a price well under market value. Sager, a man with his own violent reputation and connections, wasn't going to be pushed around. So he arranged for a hitman to be waiting, lured Bromley to his house under the pretense of a friendly visit, and set up the execution. When the doorbell rang, Sager knew exactly who was on the other side. The evidence? Circumstantial. The property dispute, the timing, the fact that Bromley felt safe enough to remove his body armor in Sager's house, and the suspiciously clean way the whole thing played out. No forced entry, no struggle, no witnesses except the homeowner. But here's the problem with this theory. The jury didn't buy it, and neither did a lot of people in Liverpool's underworld. Because Sager was already planning to sell the house and retire to Spain. Why risk a murder charge over a property deal when you're about to leave the country anyway? Unless, of course, it wasn't about the money at all. Unless Sager had other reasons to want Bromley dead. Theory 2. It was a professional hit arranged by someone else entirely. This theory shifts the focus away from Sager and onto the £100,000 contract that had been circulating for months. George Bromley had tortured, robbed, and terrorised dozens of dealers across Liverpool. Every scar he left was a reason for revenge. Every crew he taxed had a grudge. And by 1997, the list of people who wanted him dead was long enough to fill a phone book. The contract was real. The threat was real. And whoever put up that money eventually found someone willing to collect it. In this version of events, Sager is exactly what he claimed to be. An unlucky homeowner who opened his door to a stranger and watched his guest get executed in his kitchen. The killer used Sager's house as a convenient location. Maybe they knew Bromley would be there, maybe they followed him, but Sager himself had no involvement. The hitman did the job, collected the money, and disappeared. This theory fits the evidence. It explains the professional execution style. 3 shots, silenced weapon, no hesitation. It explains why the killer was never caught, because professional hitmen don't get caught if they're good enough. And it explains the wall of silence from the underworld. because whoever paid for the contract didn't want their name attached to it. But it leaves one big question unanswered. How did the killer know Bromley would be at Sager's house that specific night? Theory 3. It was someone close to Bromley who set him up. This is the darkest theory and the one that gets whispered about most quietly. What if the person who killed George Bromley wasn't a stranger at all? What if it was someone he trusted? Someone who knew his schedule, knew where he'd be, and knew he'd let his guard down. In this version, the killer didn't need to force their way into Sager's house. They were invited. Or they were already inside. Or they arrived knowing Bromley would be there because they'd helped arrange the meeting. This theory explains everything. The timing, the access, the lack of struggle, the fact that Bromley removed his body armor because he felt safe around whoever pulled the trigger. But it also raises the most disturbing question of all. Who was close enough to Bromley to betray him like that? And why has no one ever named them? George Bromley's murder changed Liverpool's underworld forever. Not because he was mourned, not because his death sparked a gang war or a wave of retaliatory violence, but because of what it proved. It proved that no one was untouchable. For years, Bromley had operated with near total impunity. He'd survived shootings, beaten court cases, and built a reputation so terrifying that hardened criminals would hand over tens of thousands of pounds rather than face him. He'd tortured dozens of people, broken every code the old generation had lived by, and walked away laughing every single time. And then, in 30 seconds, he was erased. The message rippled through Liverpool instantly. If George Bromley, the man with the iron, the man who made others break, could be taken out that easily, then everyone was vulnerable. Body armor didn't matter. Guns didn't matter. Reputation didn't matter. All it took was the right price and the right moment. The underworld recalibrated. In the month after Bromley's death, several high-profile figures quietly left Liverpool. Some moved to Spain, others disappeared into legitimate businesses. A few simply stopped showing their faces in the clubs and pubs where they'd once held court. The era of the freelance enforcer, the lone operator who could tax entire crews through fear alone, was over. The game had evolved. If you wanted to survive, you needed to be part of something bigger. An organization, a firm, something with enough manpower and firepower to protect you when the contracts started circulating. And the contracts never stopped circulating. Because Bromley's murder also proved something else. You could get away with it. The investigation had gone nowhere. Sager was acquitted. The actual shooter was never identified. And whoever put up the £100,000 remained anonymous. The case was technically still open, but everyone knew it would never be solved. It became a blueprint. If you wanted someone dead, you put up the money, you found the right person, and you made sure there were no witnesses who'd talk. Simple, clean, effective. Liverpool's murder rate didn't spike immediately after Bromley's death, but the nature of the violence changed. Executions became more professional, hitmen became more common, and the wall of silence around these killings became impenetrable. For George Bromley's family, the aftermath was devastating. His wife and 2 young sons were left to process not just his death, but the manner of it, the brutality, the inevitability, the fact that everyone in Liverpool seemed to know it was coming, except them. Bromley had been planning to move the family to Portugal, to get out of the game, to disappear into a quiet retirement funded by the screams of the people he tortured. Instead, his sons grew up in the shadow of a man whose name still provokes visceral reactions across Merseyside. A man whose reputation was built on inflicting agony. A man whose death was celebrated in some circles and quietly mourned in almost none. And for the person who killed him, they collected their money and walked away. No arrest, no trial, no consequences, just a payday and a disappearance. 28 years later, the case remains officially unsolved. Merseyside police still list it as an open investigation, but no new leads have emerged in decades. The file sits in a warehouse somewhere, gathering dust alongside hundreds of other murders that will never see justice. But in Liverpool's underworld, the truth is an open secret. People know who did it, or at least they know who was involved. The names get whispered in certain pubs, hinted at in certain conversations, but no one's talking to the police. No one's making statements. No one's breaking the code. Because George Bromley's murder wasn't just an execution, it was a message. And the message was simple. Fear only works until someone stops being afraid. Reputations only protect you until someone decides the price is worth paying. And in a city where violence had already become the only language anyone understood, the rules had changed forever. The case remains officially unsolved, but somewhere in Liverpool, someone knows exactly what happened that night. They know who pulled the trigger. They know who paid for it. They know why. And they've chosen to stay silent for 28 years. That silence tells you everything you need to know about how justice works in Liverpool's underworld, and why some murders are never meant to be solved. The man who made others break died without breaking himself, but his death broke something far bigger. It broke the illusion that anyone in Liverpool's underworld was ever truly safe. If you want more stories like this, deep dives into the UK's most notorious unsolved crimes, the cases that shaped entire cities, and the people who got away with murder, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Drop a comment below. Do you think Charlie Sager was involved, or was he just in the wrong place at the wrong time? What's your theory on who really killed George Bromley? And if you want to hear about another Liverpool murder that changed everything, check out the video on related case in the description below. Thanks for watching. Stay safe out there.